Picture this. The year is 323 BC. In a sweltering palace in Babylon, Alexander of Macedon, the man who conquered the known world, lies dying at just 32 years old. His empire stretches from Greece to the borders of India, an achievement unmatched in human history. But 3,000 kilometers to the west, in the rugged mountains of central Italy, another power is rising: Rome, a city-state locked in a brutal war with the Samnite tribes, forging itself in blood and iron. Two military juggernauts, two completely different ways of war. One relies on the longest spears ever wielded in battle, and the genius of a single man. The other has spent 4 centuries perfecting the art of organized slaughter, learning from every defeat, coming back stronger every time. Alexander never lost a battle. Rome lost many and became invincible because of it. What would have happened if these two titans had collided? Tonight, we're going to find out. This is the war for the world that never happened. If you're ready to witness the most epic showdown in alternate history, hit that like button right now and subscribe to Wars in History. We're diving deep into 3 hours of pure military analysis, strategic genius, and the brutal truth of ancient warfare. Ring that notification bell because you don't want to miss a second of this. In the summer of 323 BC, as Alexander the Great took his final breaths in Babylon, the Roman Republic was embroiled in the Second Samnite War, a grinding conflict in the highlands of central Italy that would drag on until 304 BC. These two powers existed in the same world at the same time, yet they never met on the battlefield. Alexander's conquests had taken him east, toward the vast wealth of Persia and the mysterious lands of India. Rome's ambitions were focused on the Italian peninsula, where every valley and hilltop had to be conquered tribe by tribe, city by city. But history loves its what-ifs, and this is perhaps the greatest military what-if of the ancient world. Alexander commanded an army that had marched over 20,000 kilometers, from the Balkans to the Indus River. At the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, he shattered a Persian force that outnumbered him as much as 3-1. At the Hydaspes River in 326 BC, he defeated King Porus and his war elephants in the monsoon rains of India. His Macedonian Phalanx, bristling with 18-foot sarissa spears, was the most feared infantry formation of its age. His Companion Cavalry, 1,800 elite horsemen, delivered the killing blow in battle after battle. Alexander himself was a tactical genius, a man who could read a battlefield like others read poetry, exploiting every weakness, turning every disadvantage into victory. Rome in 323 BC was not the empire that would later dominate the Mediterranean. It was a republic fighting for survival and expansion in Italy. Just 2 years earlier, in 321 BC, a Roman army of 20,000 men had been humiliated at the Caudine Forks, forced to pass under the yoke in one of Rome's most shameful defeats. But Rome did not break. It adapted. The Roman legion of this period was organized in the manipular system, a revolutionary formation developed specifically to fight in the mountains against the Samnites. Unlike the rigid phalanx, the legion was divided into 3 lines of heavy infantry, the hastati, principes, and triarii, supported by light velises skirmishers. Each maniple could operate independently, probing for weaknesses, falling back, striking again. The Romans fought with the gladius, a short stabbing sword perfect for close combat, and the pilum, a heavy javelin designed to bend on impact and render enemy shields useless. Where Alexander's army was built around the genius of one man, Rome's military was a system, constantly refined by 400 years of warfare. So what if Alexander had turned west instead of east? What if, after securing Greece in 335 BC, he had set his sights on the growing power of Rome? What if the Macedonian Phalanx had crashed into the Roman legion not in the 2nd century BC, when Macedonia was a shadow of its former self, but in 323 BC, when Alexander was at the height of his power and Rome was still clawing its way to dominance? This is not a simple question of tactics. It's a question of systems, of geography, of psychology, of logistics. It's a question that military historians have debated for centuries, and tonight we're going to answer it. We'll examine both armies in excruciating detail, their weapons, their tactics, their strengths and fatal weaknesses. We'll map out a hypothetical campaign across Italy, through battles in the plains, in the mountains, in sieges of walled cities, and we'll reach a verdict based not on speculation, but on the hard evidence of how these armies actually performed in history. This is not fantasy. This is rigorous military analysis. This is the war for the world that never happened. Welcome to 3 hours of the most detailed alternate history battle you've ever seen. Let's begin. To understand what would have happened if Alexander had marched west, you first need to understand the army he commanded. This was not just any army. This was the most sophisticated military instrument the ancient world had ever seen, forged over 2 generations by Philip II and perfected by his son. When Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 BC, he brought with him approximately 47,000 men. 24,000 were Macedonian and Greek infantry. 1,800 were Companion Cavalry, the elite shock troops who would break enemy lines. 3,000 were hypaspists, the shield-bearers who formed the bridge between the phalanx and the cavalry. The rest were Thracian light infantry, Cretan archers, and allied Greek contingents. But numbers tell only part of the story. What made this army unstoppable was how these parts worked together as a single, devastating machine. The core of Alexander's infantry was the Macedonian Phalanx. Imagine a block of men, 16 ranks deep, each soldier gripping a sarissa pike that measured between 5 and 6 meters in length. That is 18 to 20 feet of sharp iron pointing at you. The sarissa was made of cornel wood, light enough to be wielded with 2 hands but strong enough not to snap under pressure. It had an iron spearhead at one end and a bronze butt spike at the other. That spike served 3 purposes. It acted as a counterweight, making the massive pike easier to control. It could be driven into the ground to receive a charge, and if the spearhead broke, you could flip it around and keep fighting. Because the sarissa required both hands, the phalangite could not carry the traditional hoplite shield. Instead, he wore a small shield called a pelter, hung from his neck by a leather strap protecting his left shoulder and chest. His armour was minimal, usually a bronze or leather cuirass, a helmet and greaves for his shins. The goal was not to make him invulnerable. The goal was to make him part of an invulnerable formation. When the phalanx locked shields and lowered pikes, it became a moving wall of death. The first 5 ranks could angle their sarissas forward at different heights, creating a hedge of spear points so dense that nothing could penetrate it. The men in the rear ranks held their pikes vertically, ready to step forward when the front ranks fell. This was not a formation that engaged in individual combat. There was no room for heroics, no space for swordplay. This was industrial killing. The phalanx advanced slowly, relentlessly, like a glacier made of iron and wood. If the enemy stood, they were impaled. If they broke and ran, the cavalry ran them down. At the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, the phalanx held the centre against a Persian force of over 100,000 men. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, it faced war, elephants, scythed chariots, and waves of cavalry, and it did not break. The Macedonian Phalanx was not just a tactical formation. It was a psychological weapon. Armies saw it coming and lost the will to fight. But the Phalanx had weaknesses. It was rigid. It needed flat, open ground. It could not turn quickly. Its flanks were vulnerable. If an enemy got around the sides or attacked from behind, the sarissas became useless, and the phalangites with their small shields and minimal armour were slaughtered. Philip and Alexander knew this. That is why they built an army around the phalanx to protect it and exploit the chaos it created. On the right flank of the phalanx, directly next to the pikemen, stood the hypaspists. These were not regular infantry. They were elite shield-bearers, 3,000 strong, hand-picked for their skill and loyalty. Unlike the phalangites, the hypaspists carried traditional round shields, not pelters. They were more heavily armoured and could fight in looser formations. Their job was to guard the right flank of the phalanx and to move quickly wherever the battle demanded. At Gaugamela, when Persian cavalry nearly broke through the Macedonian right, it was the hypaspists who stopped them. At the Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BC, they were the first to cross the water, securing the beachhead under a storm of Indian arrows. The hypaspists were the glue that held Alexander's army together, the flexible force that could adapt when the rigid phalanx could not. And then there were the companions. The Companion Cavalry was the hammer that shattered enemy armies after the phalanx had fixed them in place. 1,800 horsemen, organised into 8 squadrons of about 200 men each, with the royal squadron numbering 400 and commanded by Alexander himself. These were not ordinary cavalrymen. They were Macedonian aristocrats, trained from childhood to ride and fight. They wore bronze or iron breastplates, helmets with cheek guards, and carried a cavalry lance called a ziston, shorter than the sarissa but still 2.5 to 3 meters long, with a secondary spear point on the butt end. They did not carry shields. They relied on speed, shock, and violence. The companions fought in a wedge formation, a triangle with Alexander at the tip. This allowed them to concentrate their force at a single point, smashing through enemy lines like a battering ram. Once through, they would wheel and attack the enemy from behind or drive straight for the enemy commander. Alexander understood that ancient battles were won by breaking the enemy's will to fight, and the fastest way to do that was to kill or capture the enemy king. At Issus, Alexander led the companions in a charge directly at Darius III. The Persian king fled, and with him the battle was lost. At Gaugamela, Alexander did the same thing. He saw a gap open in the Persian line, drove the companions through it, and made straight for Darius. Once, again Darius ran, and once again the Persian army collapsed. This was not accident. This was the entire Macedonian tactical system, the hammer and the anvil, repeated again and again with mechanical precision. Supporting these main forces were light troops, Cretan archers, Agrianian javelin men, Thracian peltasts. These skirmishers screened the main army, harassed the enemy, and pursued routing forces. They were not decisive in battle, but they were essential for reconnaissance, foraging, and maintaining pressure. Alexander also had siege engineers, the best in the ancient world. At Tyre in 332 BC, he built a causeway 1/2 kilometre long to reach an island fortress, then battered down its walls with siege towers and catapults. At the Sogdian Rock in 327 BC, he sent climbers up a sheer cliff at night to attack a supposedly impregnable fortress from above. Alexander did not just win battles. He solved military problems that other commanders thought unsolvable, the genius of Alexander's system was integration. Every part of his army supported every other part. The phalanx fixed the enemy in place. The hypaspist protected the phalanx. The companions exploited the gaps the phalanx created. The light troops covered the flanks and pursued the broken enemy. And Alexander himself, always at the front, always leading the charge, held it all together through sheer force of will. He was wounded 9 times in 12 years. At the Mali town in India, he took an arrow through the lung that nearly killed him. His men did not follow him because they were afraid of him. They followed him because he would not ask them to do anything he would not do himself. But there was a weakness in this system, and it was the same weakness that plagued every army built around a single genius. What happened when Alexander was not there? The phalanx was still deadly, the companions were still elite, but the coordination suffered. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, his generals fought each other for 40 years, and they lost battles to enemies Alexander would have crushed. The Macedonian army was the best in the world when Alexander commanded it. Without him, it is merely excellent. Now let us turn west to Italy, to Rome, in 323 BC. This was not the Rome of Caesar, not the empire that would span 3 continents. This was a republic fighting for survival in a brutal, decades-long struggle against the Samnites, the toughest mountain warriors in Italy. Rome in 323 BC controlled perhaps 10,000 square kilometers of territory, mostly in Latium and northern Campania. It was surrounded by enemies, the Samnites to the east and south, the Etruscans to the north, the Greek cities on the coast. Rome had been fighting almost continuously for 2 centuries, and it had learned the hard way that the old Greek-style phalanx did not work in the mountains of central Italy. The Roman military system in 323 BC was built around the legion, and the legion was organized in the manipular system. Unlike the Macedonian Phalanx, which was a single rigid block, the Roman legion was divided into smaller independent units called maniples. Each legion had 30 maniples, organized in 3 lines. The first line, closest to the enemy, was the hastati. These were young men, the newest soldiers, armed with 2 pila, heavy javelins, a gladius short sword, and a large rectangular shield called a scutum. There were 10 maniples of hastati, each with 120 men, for a total of 1,200. Behind the hastati were the princeps, men in the prime of life, the backbone of the army. They had the same equipment as the hastati and the same organization, 10 maniples of 120 men. And behind the princeps were the triarii, the veterans, the oldest and wealthiest soldiers. They were equipped differently. They carried long spears instead of swords, and they fought in a more traditional style. There were 10 maniples of triarii, but each had only 60 men, for a total of 600. The Romans had a saying, "It has come to the triarii." It meant the situation was desperate, because if the battle reached the 3rd line, it meant the first 2 had failed. In front of these 3 lines were the veletes, light infantry, young men too poor to afford heavy armour. They wore no armour at all, just a leather cap and a small round shield. They carried several light javelins and were trained to harass the enemy, then fall back through the gaps in the maniples. The entire legion, with velites and cavalry, numbered about 4,500 men, roughly the size of a Macedonian Phalanx division. But what made the manipular legion revolutionary was not the equipment. It was the tactics. The maniples were arranged in a checkerboard pattern called the quincunx, the hastati in front, with gaps between each maniple, the princeps behind, positioned to cover the gaps in the first line, the triarii behind them, covering the gaps in the second line. This meant that the legion could operate on broken ground, in forests, in mountains, places where the Macedonian phalanx would trip over itself and collapse. Each maniple could act independently, probing for weaknesses, falling back if needed, advancing if the enemy gave ground. If the Astati were pushed back, they retreated through the gaps in the princeps, who then engaged. If the princeps were pushed back, they retreated through the triarii, who lowered their spears and made a last stand. The key to this system was flexibility. The Romans did not try to win battles with a single crushing blow. They won through attrition, through constant pressure, through the ability to adapt to any situation. At the Battle of Sentinum in 295 BC, still 28 years in the future from our scenario but illustrative of Roman tactics, a Roman army faced a coalition of Samnites and Gauls. The Gallic charge broke through the Roman left. Any other army would have routed, the Romans did not. The right wing held, the reserves moved to plug the gap, and the Romans ground down the enemy until they broke. This was the Roman way of war. Relentless, disciplined, unbreakable. The weapons of the Roman legionary were designed for this kind of fighting. The pilum was a javelin about 2 meters long, with a long iron shank and a small pyramid-shaped head. It was designed to punch through shields and armour, and the iron shank was engineered to bend on impact. This meant the enemy could not throw it back, and if it stuck in a shield, the weight of the bent iron would drag the shield down, forcing the enemy to discard it. Each legionary carried 2 pila. The first was thrown at 15 meters, the second at 7. Then the legionary drew his gladius and closed for hand-to-hand combat. The gladius was a short sword about 60 to 70 centimeters long, double-edged, with a sharp point. It was not designed for slashing. It was designed for stabbing. In the tight press of battle, there was no room for wild swings. The legionary stood behind his scutum protected, and when an opening appeared, a gap in the enemy's guard, he thrust the gladius forward, into the belly, into the throat, then pulled back behind his shield. It was efficient. It was brutal. It was murder made systematic. The scutum itself was a marvel of military engineering. It was a large, curved, rectangular shield, about 1¼ meters tall and ½ meter wide, made of layers of wood glued together and covered in leather and canvas. It had an iron boss in the centre, a metal dome that protected the hand and could be used to punch an enemy in the face. The scutum was heavy, about 10 kilograms, but it provided nearly total protection from missiles and could interlock with other shields to form a wall. In the famous testudo formation, legionaries would lock shields above their heads and on all sides, creating a mobile fortress that could advance under a hail of arrows. Roman armour in 323 BC was not standardized the way it would be in the later empire. The wealthier soldiers wore chainmail, the lorica hamata, which provided excellent protection but was expensive and heavy. Most wore a bronze chest plate or a reinforced linen corselet, or nothing at all. Helmets were more common, usually bronze with cheek guards and a neck flap. The goal was not to make every soldier invulnerable. The goal was to make the formation invulnerable, because that is the fundamental difference between the Macedonian Phalanx and the Roman legion. The phalanx was a weapon built to destroy the enemy in a single, decisive engagement. The legion was a weapon built to endure, to adapt, to keep fighting no matter what happened. Alexander's army won battles, Rome's army won wars, and Rome in 323 BC was at war. The Second Samnite War had been raging since 327 BC. Just 2 years before, in 321 BC, a Roman army had been trapped in a narrow pass at the Caudine Forks and forced to surrender without a fight. 20,000 Roman soldiers had been disarmed and made to pass under a yoke of spears, a ritual humiliation that signified total defeat. Rome could have sued for peace. Instead, it declared the treaty invalid, executed the commanders who had agreed to it, and raised new legions. By 323 BC, Rome was back on the offensive. This was a state that did not know how to quit. The Samnites were not a pushover. They were the Macedonians of Italy, fierce mountain warriors who had been fighting Rome to a standstill for decades. They used terrain to their advantage, ambushing Roman columns in narrow valleys, striking and fading away before the legions could bring their weight to bear. They fought with long spears, much like the Greek hoplite, and heavy shields. If Rome could grind down the Samnites, it could grind down anyone. But the Roman military in 323 BC had weaknesses. Rome did not have a professional army. Every soldier was a citizen who provided his own equipment and fought for the duration of the campaign, then returned to his farm. This meant the quality of troops varied wildly depending on wealth and training. Rome did not have a cavalry tradition. Roman aristocrats fought as infantry officers, not as cavalry, and the Roman cavalry in this period was small and ineffective. Rome relied on allied Italian cavalry, which was decent but not elite. Rome did not have a tradition of military genius. Rome did not have an Alexander, a single commander whose brilliance could win battles against impossible odds. What Rome had was a system that produced good commanders consistently, a system that learned from defeats, a system that could replace losses and keep fighting. So now we have our two contenders, Alexander's army, 47,000 men, built around the hammer and anvil of phalanx and cavalry, led by a tactical genius who had never lost a battle. Rome's army, legions numbering in the tens of thousands, built for flexibility and endurance, commanded by consuls elected annually, hardened by generations of brutal warfare in the Italian mountains. On paper, the advantage goes to Alexander in almost every category. His infantry has longer reach. His cavalry is far superior. His command and control is centralized under a proven genius. His army has experience fighting and defeating enemies far larger and more sophisticated than Rome. But paper does not win wars. Terrain wins wars. Logistics win wars. Morale wins wars. And in all of those categories, the matchup is not so simple. Alexander's army was designed to fight on the plains of Asia. Wide open spaces where the phalanx could deploy in its full terrifying glory, where the companions could maneuver and charge. Italy is not the plains of Asia. Italy is mountains, narrow valleys, forests, rivers. The kind of terrain where the phalanx becomes a liability, where the legion thrives. Alexander's army marched thousands of kilometers, but it marched through lands that submitted or were conquered. It lived off the spoils of the Persian Empire, the richest state in the world. Italy was poor. There were no vast supply depots to capture, no tribute to seize. Every mile would have to be fought for, every city besieged. And Rome did not have a Darius who would flee at the first setback. Rome did not have a king whose death would end the war. Rome was a republic. Kill one consul, and another would be elected. Destroy one legion, and two more would be raised. Rome would not stop. This is the question we're going to answer. Not which army was better in the abstract, but which army would win in the specific, brutal context of a campaign in Italy in 323 BC. And to answer that, we need to map out exactly how that campaign would unfold. Let us establish the precise scenario. The year is 323 BC. Alexander has just concluded his conquest of the Persian Empire. He sits in Babylon, master of an empire that stretches from Macedonia to the Indus River. But in this alternate timeline, something has changed. Perhaps it is a vision. Perhaps it is ambition. Perhaps it is the challenge of conquering the unknown West. Alexander turns his gaze toward Italy and the rising power of Rome. Word has reached him of a city-state in central Italy that refuses to bend the knee to any overlord, that fights wars of total commitment, that has been at war almost continuously for 2 centuries and shows no signs of stopping. This is a challenge Alexander cannot ignore. Rome must be brought into the empire, or it must be destroyed. Alexander demobilizes the Persian contingents of his army, keeping only his core Macedonian and Greek forces. He does not need numbers. He needs speed, discipline, and the soldiers who have followed him for a decade. His army numbers approximately 40,000 men, 30,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and a siege train that includes the best engineers in the world. He marches west, from Babylon through Syria, along the coast of Asia Minor, across the Hellespont, through Thrace and Macedonia, gathering supplies and reinforcements as he goes. By the winter of 323 BC, he is in Epirus, on the Adriatic coast, preparing to cross into Italy. Rome in 323 BC is locked in the Second Samnite War. The war began in 327 BC when Rome violated a treaty with the Samnites by interfering in the affairs of Naples. For 4 years, the war has ground on with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. In 321 BC, Rome suffered the humiliating defeat at the Caudine Forks, where 20,000 legionaries were trapped in a mountain pass and forced to surrender without a fight. The Samnites, lacking the manpower to hold so many prisoners, disarmed them and sent them home after making them pass under a yoke of spears, a ritual that signified Rome's total submission. Rome responded by declaring the peace treaty invalid, raising new legions and resuming the war. By 323 BC, Rome controls perhaps 15,000 square kilometers of territory. 4 full legions are deployed in Samnium, approximately 20,000 men. Another 2 legions garrison the city and the surrounding Latin territories. Rome's total military strength is approximately 35 to 40,000 men, but these are spread across a front that runs from the hills of Samnium to the coast at Capua. Rome's allies in Latium and Campania can provide additional troops, but these are of variable quality. The Latin cities are required by treaty to provide soldiers, but many resent Roman dominance and would happily switch sides if given the opportunity. The Greek cities of southern Italy, Tarentum, Croton, and Thurii, are wealthy and populous, but militarily weak. They have been calling for a champion to protect them from the Italian tribes for decades. When they hear that Alexander of Macedon is planning an invasion, many send embassies begging him to come, promising supplies, harbours, and gold. Alexander does not need their encouragement. He is coming. The strategic geography of Italy is critical to understanding this campaign. Italy is not Persia. Persia was a vast flat empire with a centralized government that collapsed when its king fled the field. Italy is a rugged peninsula dominated by the Apennine Mountains, which run like a spine down the centre from north to south for over 1,000 kilometres. The mountains are not uniformly high. The highest peaks in the Abruzzi region reach nearly 3,000 metres, but most of the range consists of steep hills and narrow valleys. This is terrain that favours the defender, where small forces can block passes, where supply lines are easily cut, where the Macedonian Phalanx cannot deploy. The western side of Italy, the Tyrrhenian coast, has fertile plains in Latium, Campania and Etruria, but these are separated by stretches of hills and marshland. The eastern side, the Adriatic coast, is narrower and more rugged, with fewer good harbours. Alexander's logical invasion route is from Epirus across the Adriatic to the heel of Italy, landing at or near Tarentum, the largest and wealthiest Greek city in Italy. Tarentum sits on an excellent natural harbour and controls the trade routes between Greece and Italy. From Tarentum, Alexander has three strategic options. He can march north along the Adriatic coast, taking the Via Salaria toward Rome. This route passes through hostile territory and offers few opportunities for the kind of decisive battle Alexander prefers. He can march west across the Apennines into Campania, aiming to link up with the Greek cities on the Tyrrhenian coast and cut Rome off from its richest territories. Or he can march northwest directly toward Rome through Samnium, the heartland of Rome's enemies, turning the Second Samnite War into a three-way fight. Alexander chooses the third option. His intelligence tells him that Rome is already stretched thin fighting the Samnites. If he can form an alliance with the Samnites and crush Rome between two armies, the war will be over in a single campaign season. The Samnites are natural allies. They fight in a Greek-influenced style with heavy infantry and long spears. They hate Rome with a passion born of generations of warfare. Alexander sends emissaries to the Samnite Confederacy offering an alliance. The terms are simple. Fight alongside Alexander, and when Rome falls, Samnium will be independent under Macedonian protection. The Samnite leaders agree. They have been fighting Rome for decades. This is their chance to end it. In the spring of 322 BC, Alexander's army crosses the Adriatic. His fleet, a mix of Macedonian, Greek and Phoenician ships, lands at Tarentum without opposition. The city opens its gates and welcomes Alexander as a liberator. Within days, delegations from Croton, Metapontum and Thurii arrive offering supplies and troops. Alexander accepts their supplies but declines their troops. He does not need untrained Greek militias. He needs speed and striking power. He leaves a small garrison in Tarentum to secure his supply base and marches north with his main army towards Samnium. Rome's reaction is swift. The Senate receives word of Alexander's landing within a week. Messengers gallop to the legions in Samnium with orders to break off the campaign and fall back toward Rome. The Romans are not fools. They know who Alexander is. Stories of Granicus, Issus and Gaugamela have spread across the Mediterranean. Rome cannot afford to fight Alexander and the Samnites simultaneously. The consuls, Gaius Sulpicius Longus and Quintus Aulus Ceratanus, issue orders for a general mobilization. Every Roman citizen between the ages of 17 and 46 is called to arms. The Latin allies are ordered to send their contingents. Within 2 weeks, Rome has assembled 6 legions, approximately 30,000 men, with another 10,000 allied troops. This is the largest army Rome has ever fielded. But the Romans face a dilemma. Where will Alexander strike? If they concentrate their entire army in one location, Alexander can march around them and strike at Rome itself. If they divide their forces, Alexander can defeat them piecemeal. The consuls decide to adopt a defensive strategy. They position 4 legions, approximately 20,000 men, at Beneventum, a fortified town in northern Campania that sits astride the main road from Samnium to Rome. This position allows them to block Alexander's most direct route to Rome while staying close enough to the capital to respond if he tries to swing around them. The remaining 2 legions garrison Rome itself and hold the line against any Samnite attacks from the east. Alexander's route takes him through the Lucanian mountains, up the valley of the Bradano River, and into the highlands of Samnium. His Samnite allies join him with 10,000 men, hardened mountain fighters who know every pass and trail in the region. By Late spring, Alexander's combined force of 50,000 men is camped in the hills northeast of Beneventum. The Romans are 20 kilometers to the west, dug in behind field fortifications waiting. Both sides send out cavalry patrols to scout the enemy. Small skirmishes erupt daily, but neither side is willing to commit to a major engagement yet. Alexander knows that time is on his side. Every day he remains undefeated, more Italian tribes will flock to his banner. Rome's Latin allies are already wavering. If Alexander can win a single decisive victory, Rome's alliance system will collapse. The Romans know this too. They cannot afford to lose a single battle. Their strategy is simple: avoid defeat, drag the war out, bleed Alexander's army through attrition, and wait for his supplies to run out. In early summer of 322 BC, Alexander forces the issue. He breaks camp and marches his army west toward the Roman position. The terrain between the two armies is a series of rolling hills, covered in scrub vegetation, cut by seasonal streams. It is not ideal ground for either army, but it is the best Alexander is going to get in Italy. The Romans see the Macedonian army approaching and deploy for battle. The consuls position their 4 legions in the standard Roman formation. The velites, light infantry, spread out in front to harass the enemy with javelins. Behind them, the hastati form the first line, 10 maniples arranged in the checkerboard pattern with gaps between each unit. Behind the hastati, the principes form the second line, positioned to cover the gaps in the first line, and behind the princeps, the triarii form the third line, the reserve, the final bulwark if everything else fails. The Roman cavalry, approximately 2,000 horse, is split between the two flanks, with allied Italian cavalry reinforcing the left. Alexander surveys the Roman position from a hilltop and makes his dispositions. He places his phalanx in the centre, 24,000 men, in a block 16 ranks deep, bristling with sarissas. The hypaspists, 3,000 men, are positioned on the right flank of the phalanx, ready to pivot and support wherever needed. The Companion Cavalry, 1,800 strong with Alexander at their head, is massed on the right wing. The Thessalian Cavalry, 2,000 horse, is on the left wing. The Samnite Infantry, 10,000 men, is held in reserve behind the phalanx. Alexander's plan is classic. Fix the Roman centre with the phalanx, smash the Roman right with the companions, then roll up the Roman line from the flank. The battle begins with the light troops engaging. Roman velites advance, hurling their javelins at the Macedonian phalanx, then falling back through the gaps in the hastati. Alexander's skirmishers, Cretan archers and Agricanian javelin men, return fire. For an hour the two forces trade missiles and casualties mount. The phalanx holds formation, shields raised, sarissas pointed skyward, waiting. Then Alexander gives the order. Trumpets sound. The phalanx lowers its pikes and advances. The sight of the Macedonian phalanx in motion is unlike anything the Romans have ever seen. A wall of bronze and iron, 30 men wide and 16 ranks deep, moving forward with the mechanical precision of a machine. The first 5 ranks have their sarissas levelled, creating a hedge of spear points 5 meters deep. The Romans see it coming and brace themselves. The hastati lock shields and ready their pila. At 15 meters the order is given. 2,000 javelins arc through the air. They crash into the phalanx. Men scream and fall. The sarissas waver, but the phalanx does not stop. At 7 meters the Romans throw their second pila. More Macedonians fall. Still the phalanx comes on, and then with a sound like thunder the two lines collide. The Roman hastati are brave men, the best infantry Rome has produced. But they are facing an enemy they do not understand. The sarissa is 6 meters long. The Roman gladius is less than a meter. The hastati cannot reach the phalangites. They try to push forward, stabbing with their swords, but the sarissas are everywhere, a forest of iron points that cannot be dodged or parried. The first rank of hastati is impaled. The second rank stumbles over the bodies of the first. The third rank tries to hold, shields locked, but the weight of the phalanx is irresistible. The Roman line buckles. The hastati begin to fall back, not in rout, but in controlled retreat, moving through the gaps in the principes. This is exactly what the manipular system was designed to do. The principes step forward, fresh troops ready to engage, but the phalanx does not stop. It grinds forward, crushing everything in its path. The princeps fare no better than the hastati. They fight with desperate courage, but courage is not enough. The sarissas are simply too long. The princeps begin to fall back. The battle is on the verge of becoming a Roman disaster. But the Romans have one advantage: flexibility. The maniples on the flanks of the Roman line, seeing that the centre is collapsing, begin to shift inward, contracting the line, refusing the flanks. The phalanx, locked in its rigid formation, cannot turn to follow them. Gaps open between the phalanx and Alexander's cavalry on the wings, and into those gaps the Roman light infantry pour. Velites, armed with javelins and small shields, swarm around the flanks of the phalanx, targeting the rear ranks where the phalangites are exposed and vulnerable. Alexander sees the danger. He orders the hypospists to peel off from the phalanx and engage the velites. The hypospists, with their heavier armour and shields, drive the velites back, but this weakens the overall Macedonian line. The battle is devolving into a chaotic melee, exactly the kind of fight the Romans excel at. On the right wing, Alexander leads the Companion Cavalry in a charge against the Roman cavalry. The Companions, in their wedge formation with Alexander at the tip, smash into the Roman horsemen. The Romans fight back, but they are outclassed. The Companions are professional cavalrymen, trained since childhood. The Roman cavalry are citizen soldiers who serve a few months a year. Within minutes, the Roman right-wing cavalry is scattered. Alexander wheels his companions and prepares to charge into the rear of the Roman infantry. But before he can attack, the Roman consul Gaius Sulpicius Longus does something unexpected. He orders the triarii, the reserve, to advance. 600 veteran spearmen, the oldest and best soldiers in the army, move forward with long spears levelled. They do not charge. They march slowly, deliberately, in perfect formation, and they position themselves directly in Alexander's path, blocking the road to the Roman rear. This is the moment when Alexander realizes that Rome is not Persia. Darius fled at Issus and Gaugamela when the companions broke through. The Roman consul does not flee. He stands with the triarii, sword drawn, and waits for Alexander's charge. Alexander sees 600 men standing between him and victory. Any rational commander would order a retreat at the sight of 2,000 charging cavalry. But the triarii do not retreat. They lower their spears and brace for impact. Alexander, for the first time in his career, hesitates. Charging into a prepared infantry formation with cavalry is suicide. The companions could shatter the triarii, but they would lose half their strength doing it, and the battle would not be won. He orders the companions to wheel away and rejoin the main battle. The triarii have bought the Roman army time. On the left wing, the Thessalian cavalry has clashed with the Italian allied cavalry reinforcing the Roman left. The fight is even, neither side able to gain an advantage. In the centre, the phalanx is still grinding forward, but the Roman princeps and triarii have formed a new line and are holding. The Samnite infantry, held in reserve, has not been committed. The battle has been raging for 3 hours, and thousands of men are dead or wounded on both sides. As the sun begins to set, Alexander makes a decision. He sounds the recall. The phalanx stops its advance. The cavalry pulls back. The Macedonian army withdraws to its starting position. The Romans, battered and bloodied, do not pursue. Both sides hold the field. It is a draw. But for Rome, a draw is a victory. They faced Alexander the Great in open battle and did not break. The Battle of Beneventum is not the crushing victory Alexander expected. His casualty reports list 1,500 dead and 4,000 wounded. Most of the casualties are in the phalanx, where the fighting was fiercest. The Romans lost more men, perhaps 3,000 dead and 6,000 wounded. But Rome has more men to lose. Alexander's army is 4,500 kilometers from Macedonia. Every casualty is irreplaceable. Rome can raise new legions from its allies and rebuild. Alexander cannot. More importantly, the psychological impact of the battle ripples across Italy. Alexander the Great, the man who never lost a battle, was stopped by Rome. The Latin cities that were wavering in their loyalty to Rome now reconsider. If Rome can hold Alexander to a draw, perhaps Rome will win. The Samnites, who joined Alexander expecting easy victories and plunder, begin to question whether they have chosen the right side. Alexander moves his army south, away from the Roman position, and establishes a fortified camp near Capua. He needs time to rest his men, treat the wounded, and rethink his strategy. The phalanx is still a devastating weapon, but it is not invincible in Italy. The terrain does not favour it, and the Roman manipular system is better adapted to the close, grinding combat that dominates battles here. Alexander cannot win a war of attrition. He needs a knockout blow. He needs to draw the Romans into a battle on terrain that favours him, open ground where the phalanx can deploy fully and the cavalry can manoeuvre. The Romans, meanwhile, are celebrating. The Senate declares a day of thanksgiving to the gods. The consuls are hailed as heroes, but Rome's strategic situation is still precarious. Alexander is still in Italy with a powerful army. The Samnites are still in rebellion. Rome's resources are stretched to the breaking point. The consuls argue over strategy. Gaius Sulpicius Longus wants to maintain the defensive posture, shadowing Alexander's movements but avoiding battle unless conditions are favourable. Quintus Aulus Serratanus wants to take the offensive, to strike at Alexander before he can recover. The Senate sides with Sulpicius. Rome has learned that patience wins wars. Alexander spends the summer of 322 BC in Campania, the richest region of Italy. Campania is a fertile plain watered by the Volturnus River, with Greek cities on the coast and Roman-controlled towns inland. Alexander's strategy shifts. If he cannot defeat Rome in a single battle, he will strangle it economically. He begins besieging the Roman-held towns of Campania one by one, cutting Rome off from its richest province. His first target is Capua, the second largest city in Italy after Rome, with a population of 40,000. Capua is wealthy, cosmopolitan, and weakly defended. The Romans have a small garrison of 500 men in the city, but the city's walls are strong, and the citizens are reluctant to open the gates to a foreign conqueror. Alexander surrounds the city and begins building siege works. The siege of Capua lasts 6 weeks. Alexander's engineers construct siege towers and battering rams. They dig trenches to cut off the city's water supply. They build catapults to hurl stones over the walls. The Romans inside send messages to Rome begging for relief, but no relief comes. The Roman army is still at Beneventum, 2 days' march away, and the consuls refuse to risk a battle to save Capua. In latest summer, Capua's food supplies run out. The city council votes to surrender. Alexander accepts the surrender on generous terms. The Roman garrison is allowed to leave with their weapons. The citizens are not enslaved. Capua becomes Alexander's headquarters in Italy, and he uses its wealth to pay his troops and buy the loyalty of other Italian cities. The fall of Capua is a strategic disaster for Rome. Campania produces much of the grain that feeds Rome's population. With Capua in Macedonian hands, Rome must import grain from Sicily and Sardinia, expensive and vulnerable to interdiction. More cities in Campania defect to Alexander. Cumae, Nola and Nuceria open their gates without a fight. By the end of summer, Alexander controls the entire region. But Alexander's supply situation is deteriorating. His army is living off the land, requisitioning grain and livestock from the countryside. This makes him unpopular with the Italian population, even those who initially welcomed him. The Samnites who joined Alexander as allies are angry that they are not receiving a share of the plunder. Tensions rise in Alexander's camp. Small-scale desertions begin. The campaign is not going as planned. In October 322 BC, Alexander receives intelligence that a Roman supply convoy is moving south from Rome toward the army at Beneventum. The convoy is protected by a single legion, approximately 5,000 men, and is travelling along the Via Latina, the main road that crosses the Volturnus River near the town of Casilinum. Alexander sees an opportunity. If he can destroy the convoy and the legion protecting it, he can force the Roman army at Beneventum to withdraw due to lack of supplies. Alexander marches his army north from Capua with 20,000 men, leaving the rest to garrison the city and maintain the siege works. He moves fast, covering 50 kilometers in 2 days, and reaches the Volturnus River ahead of the Roman convoy. He deploys his army on the south bank of the river in the open plain near Casilinum. This is the ground he has been looking for: flat, open, perfect for the phalanx and cavalry. The Roman legion, commanded by the praetor Marcus Valerius, arrives at the river and sees Alexander's army waiting on the far side. Valerius has orders to protect the convoy at all costs, but he is outnumbered 4-1. A prudent commander would retreat, but Roman commanders are not trained to retreat. They are trained to fight. Valerius orders his legion to cross the river and engage. The Volturnus is shallow at this time of year, less than a metre deep, but the current is strong. The Romans cross in column, maniples moving one at a time, reforming on the south bank. Alexander waits until half the legion has crossed, then attacks. The companions charge the Roman cavalry, scattering them in minutes. The phalanx advances against the Roman infantry, which is still trying to form up after the river crossing. It is a massacre. The Roman hastati, caught in the open with no support, are run down by the cavalry or impaled by the sarissas. The princeps fight back desperately, forming a shield wall, but they are surrounded. The triarii, still on the north bank of the river, can only watch as their comrades are slaughtered. Within 2 hours the Roman legion is destroyed. 3,000 Romans are dead. Another 1,500 are captured. The rest flee into the hills. The supply convoy is captured intact. Marcus Valerius the praetor is killed leading a final charge against the phalanx. The Battle of the Volturnus River is Alexander's first clear victory in Italy. He has destroyed a Roman legion in the open field, exactly as he destroyed Persian armies at Issus and Gaugamela. The news spreads across Italy. Alexander the Great has proven that he can still win battles. Rome's Latin allies begin to waver again. Several cities in Latium send secret embassies to Alexander, offering to switch sides if he can guarantee their independence. But the victory comes at a cost. Alexander lost 500 men at the Volturnus, most of them Companion Cavalry, who pursued the fleeing Romans too far and were ambushed by local militias. His cavalry, the hammer that shatters enemy armies, is being worn down, and the destruction of a single legion does not cripple Rome. Rome has 4 more legions in the field and can raise more. The strategic balance has shifted slightly in Alexander's favour, but the war is far from over. Rome's Senate meets in emergency session after the news of the Volturnus disaster arrives. The consuls are criticised for their defensive strategy. The Senate demands action. A new policy is adopted: total mobilization. Every able-bodied citizen will be drafted. The property requirements for military service are lowered, allowing the poorest Romans to serve as light infantry. The Latin allies are threatened with destruction if they do not send their full contingents. The age limit for service is raised from 46 to 50. Rome is transforming itself into a war machine. By the winter of 322 BC, Rome has assembled 8 legions, 40,000 men, the largest army in Roman history. The price is steep. Farms are left untended. Trade collapses. The Roman economy is on the brink of ruin. But Rome has bet everything on outlasting Alexander. If the Macedonians can be forced to fight through another campaign season, if their casualties can be kept high, if their supply lines can be cut, Alexander will have to withdraw. The Romans know their history. A generation earlier, the Syracusans defeated an Athenian invasion of Sicily, not by winning battles, but by dragging the war out until Athens could no longer afford to fight. Rome is employing the same strategy. The Romans also adapt tactically. After the Battle of Beneventum, Roman commanders study how the Macedonian Phalanx fights. They notice that the phalanx is unstoppable when advancing in formation on flat ground, but it is vulnerable when standing still, when moving over rough terrain, and when attacked from the flanks or rear. The Romans develop new tactics. Instead of trying to fight the phalanx head-on, the maniples are trained to engage, fall back, engage again. Guerrilla tactics. Hit and run. The goal is not to destroy the phalanx, which is impossible. The goal is to slow it down, to disrupt its formation, to give the Roman cavalry time to work around the flanks. The Romans also develop anti-cavalry measures. They dig pits and cover them with branches, creating traps for charging horsemen. They deploy caltrops, iron spikes scattered on the ground to cripple horses. They train the velites to target the Companion Cavalry specifically, to harry them with javelins before they can build up speed for a charge. These are not the tactics of a proud, honourable army. They are the tactics of a desperate army fighting for survival, but they work. By the spring of 321 BC, Alexander has been in Italy for a full year. His army has shrunk to 35,000 men through casualties and disease. He controls Campania and has alliances with several Greek cities in the south, but he has not broken Rome. The Samnites are still his allies, but they are increasingly unreliable. Samnite warriors have begun drifting home, tired of a war that brings them little plunder and many casualties. Alexander makes a bold decision. He will march on Rome itself. If he cannot defeat Rome in the field, he will besiege the city and starve it into submission. In April 321 BC, Alexander's army marches north from Capua along the Via Appia. The Roman army, 8 legions strong, shadows him from a distance, refusing to give battle. Alexander reaches the walls of Rome in late April and begins constructing siege works. Rome in 321 BC is a city of perhaps 250,000 people, the largest city in Italy. It is built on 7 hills along the Tiber River, and its walls, the Servian Wall, are 6 meters high and 4 meters thick, made of tufa blocks. The walls stretch for 11 kilometers, encircling the entire city. Besieging Rome is a task that would challenge even Alexander's skill. Alexander's engineers survey the walls and identify weak points. The Colline Gate, on the northeastern side of the city, is the most vulnerable. Alexander concentrates his efforts there. He builds a siege mound, a massive ramp of earth and timber that will allow his soldiers to reach the top of the wall. He constructs siege towers, wooden structures on wheels that can be pushed up to the wall to provide a platform for his archers and spearmen. He builds battering rams to pound the gates. The siege works take weeks to construct, and every day Roman sorties from the city attack the workers, burning the siege equipment, killing the engineers. Inside Rome, the situation is dire. The city has large food stores, enough to last several months, but the population is enormous and panic is spreading. The Senate debates whether to negotiate or fight to the end. Some senators argue for surrender on generous terms, preserving Rome's independence under Macedonian suzerainty. Others argue that surrender is unthinkable, that Rome must fight until every citizen is dead. The Senate votes narrowly to keep fighting. The Roman army, camped 10 kilometers north of the city at the Field of Mars, receives orders to attack Alexander's siege lines. The consuls plan a coordinated assault. 4 legions will attack from the north while the remaining 4 attack from the east. The garrison inside Rome will sortie from the gates, hitting the Macedonians from 3 sides simultaneously. It is a desperate gamble, but Rome is out of options. On a morning in early June 321 BC, the Roman attack begins. 4 legions, 20,000 men, advance from the north in full battle formation. Alexander sees them coming and orders his army to deploy. He leaves a holding force of 5,000 men to continue the siege and marches with the rest of his army to meet the Romans. The 2 forces collide in the open ground north of the city. This battle is different from Beneventum or the Volturnus. The Romans do not try to fight the phalanx head-on. Instead, they use their maniples to engage and disengage, forcing the phalanx to advance across broken ground. The velites swarm around the flanks, throwing javelins, then retreating before the hypospis can catch them. The Roman cavalry avoids the companions, instead targeting the Thessalian cavalry on the left wing. It is a grinding, exhausting battle with no decisive moment. Meanwhile, the second Roman force, 4 legions attacking from the east, hits Alexander's siege lines. The Macedonians holding the siege works are outnumbered and outfought. The Romans break through, setting fire to the siege towers and destroying the battering rams. Inside Rome, the garrison sorties from the Colline Gate and attacks the Macedonian rear. Alexander's army is caught between 3 Roman forces. Alexander realizes that he is in danger of being surrounded. He orders a fighting retreat. The phalanx, still intact, forms the rear guard. The cavalry, battered but still effective, covers the flanks. The Macedonian army withdraws south, back toward Campania. The Romans pursue for a few kilometers, then stop. They have achieved their objective. The siege of Rome is broken. The Battle of the Servian Wall is a Roman victory, not because they destroyed Alexander's army, but because they forced him to retreat. Alexander leaves behind 500 dead and all of his siege equipment. The Romans lose twice as many men, but they hold the field. More importantly, Rome is saved. The failure to take Rome marks the turning point of the campaign. Alexander retreats to Capua and spends the summer of 321 BC rebuilding his army. but he's running out of options. His army is down to 30,000 men. The Samnites have largely abandoned him, their alliance, fraying after months of inconclusive fighting. The Greek cities in the south are still loyal, but they cannot provide the manpower Alexander needs. His supply lines, stretching from Tarentum through Campania, are under constant attack from Roman raiders. Rome, meanwhile, is resurgent. The successful defence of the city has electrified the population. New recruits flood the legions. The Latin allies, seeing that Rome can survive Alexander's assault, reaffirm their loyalty. By the fall of 321 BC, Rome has 10 legions in the field, 50,000 men, more soldiers than at any point in Roman history. The war settles into a stalemate. Alexander controls Campania and the Greek south. Rome controls Latium, the Apennine Mountains, and the north. Neither side can land a knockout blow. Battles are fought, towns change hands, but the strategic balance does not shift. This is exactly the kind of war Alexander cannot win. His genius is tactical, not strategic. He excels at winning battles, but Italy is too large, too poor, and too rugged to be conquered by battles alone. Every victory cost him men he cannot replace. Every defeat costs Rome men it can replace. In the winter of 321 to 320 BC, Alexander's officers begin to murmur. They have been away from home for over a year. They have fought in a foreign land for no clear purpose. The Persian Empire brought wealth and glory. Italy brings only hardship and death. Craterus, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, speaks to him privately and advises withdrawal. Alexander refuses. He's never abandoned a campaign. He will not start now. By 320 BC, the campaign has dragged on for 2 years. Alexander is still undefeated in the field, but he is no closer to conquering Rome than when he landed at Tarentum. Rome has learned to fight him on its own terms, avoiding decisive battles, bleeding his army through attrition, using the mountains and cities of Italy as fortresses that cannot be taken by storm. The phalanx remains a devastating weapon, but it cannot be everywhere at once. The companions can still win cavalry battles, but there are fewer of them with each engagement, and Rome's cavalry is improving. The hypothetical campaign has revealed a fundamental truth. Military genius can win battles, but it cannot overcome geography, logistics, and the will of an entire people to resist. Alexander's army is the best tactical instrument in the ancient world, but Rome's military system is better suited to the strategic realities of Italy. The phalanx is a weapon built for set-piece battles on open ground. The legion is a weapon built for grinding, attritional warfare in broken terrain. In Italy, the legion has the home field advantage, but the war is not over. Alexander is still in the field. Rome is exhausted, and both sides are preparing for one final decisive confrontation. The question is not whether Alexander can win battles. The question is whether he can win the war. Before we dive into the final verdict on this epic clash, if you're loving this deep dive into ancient warfare, check out our exclusive Wars in History merch. We've got campaign maps, battle formations, and designs that let you wear your passion for military history. Link in the description. Now, let's answer the ultimate question: who would win? Before we can determine who would win this war, we need to define what victory means for each side. This is not a simple question. Alexander's victory condition is clear. Force Rome to submit, either through military defeat or through a negotiated surrender that brings Rome into his empire as a subject state. But Rome's victory condition is more complex. Rome does not need to destroy Alexander's army. Rome does not even need to defeat him in battle. Rome simply needs to survive. If Alexander cannot conquer Rome within a reasonable time frame, If his army is bled down through attrition, if his supplies run out, he will have to withdraw. And withdrawal for Alexander is defeat. This asymmetry in victory conditions is critical. It means that Alexander is fighting an offensive war with a time limit, while Rome is fighting a defensive war with no time limit. History shows us that offensive wars in hostile territory, far from supply bases, against a determined enemy, are extremely difficult to win. The Athenian expedition to Syracuse in 415 to 413 BC ended in total disaster, despite Athenian military superiority. The Carthaginian invasions of Sicily in the 4th century BC repeatedly failed despite numerical advantages. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 destroyed the Grande Armée, despite winning every major battle. In each case, the attacker won battles, but lost the war because they could not achieve strategic victory before their resources ran out. So the question becomes, can Alexander achieve his victory conditions before Rome's strategy of attrition succeeds? To answer this, we need to examine every dimension of this hypothetical conflict in exhaustive detail. Let us begin with the tactical matchup, because this is where most historical debates focus. On paper, the Macedonian Phalanx should dominate the Roman legion. The sarissa pike is 6 meters long, the Roman gladius is 70 centimeters long. Simple physics says the Phalanx wins every head-to-head engagement, and indeed, in our hypothetical Battle of Beneventum, the Phalanx tore through the Astertian Principes when it advanced in formation on relatively flat ground. But the key phrase is relatively flat ground. Italy is not flat. The Apennine Mountains run down the spine of the peninsula, creating terrain that is fundamentally hostile to phalanx warfare. The phalanx requires level ground to maintain its formation. Each phalangite must stand shoulder to shoulder with his comrades, sarissa levelled at the same angle, moving at the same pace. If one man stumbles, if the line breaks, the entire formation loses its cohesion. And when the phalanx loses cohesion, it becomes a mob of men with unwieldy 18-foot pikes and small shields, easy prey for enemy infantry with swords and large shields. The Romans learned this lesson when they fought the Macedonians in the 2nd century BC, a full century after our hypothetical war. At the Battle of Cynocephalae in 197 BC, a Roman army under Titus Quinctius Flamininus faced a Macedonian phalanx under Philip V. The battle was fought on a series of low hills. On the flat sections of the battlefield, the phalanx crushed the Roman left wing, exactly as it had done for Alexander. But on the broken ground of the hilltops, the phalanx lost formation. Individual Roman maniples swarmed around the flanks of the disordered Macedonians and slaughtered them. Flamininus won the battle not through superior tactics in the traditional sense, but by choosing terrain that negated the phalanx's advantage. At the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, the Roman consul Lucius, Aemilius Paulus faced the Macedonian king Perseus. The Macedonian phalanx initially drove the Romans back, exactly as Alexander's phalanx would have done. But as the phalanx advanced across uneven ground, gaps opened in its formation. Roman maniples, operating independently, penetrated those gaps and attacked the phalangites from the side and rear. Once the Romans were inside the formation, the sarissas became useless. The Macedonians were massacred. 20,000 Macedonians died. The Romans lost 1,000 men. These battles occurred over a century after Alexander's death, against Macedonian armies that were arguably weaker than Alexander's. But the tactical lessons are clear. The phalanx is unstoppable on ideal terrain. The legion is adaptable to any terrain, and in Italy ideal terrain for the phalanx is rare. But there is a counter-argument. The Macedonians at Cynocephalae and Pydna were not led by Alexander. They were led by competent but not brilliant commanders. Alexander never lost a battle because he never let himself be drawn into unfavourable engagements. At Gaugamela, when Darius tried to outflank him, Alexander simply refused his left wing and concentrated his strength on the right. At the Hydaspes, facing Indian war elephants that could break his phalanx, Alexander used his light troops to harass the elephants and drive them back into their own lines. Alexander was a master of choosing when and where to fight. Would he have allowed himself to be drawn into battle on broken ground where the phalanx could not deploy? The answer is, possibly not. But in Italy, he would not have a choice. Italy does not have vast plains like Mesopotamia, where armies can maneuver for days to find ideal ground. In Italy, the roads run through valleys, the cities are built on hills, the farmland is broken by streams and orchards. If Alexander wants to advance on Rome, he must fight on ground that favours the defender, and the defender is Rome. Moreover, the Roman manipular system specifically evolved to fight in this terrain. During the Samnite Wars, Rome learned that the traditional Greek phalanx, which Rome had used in the 5th and early 4th centuries BC, did not work in the mountains. The Samnites would ambush phalanx formations in narrow valleys, attacking from the flanks and rear where the long spears were useless. After the disaster at the Caudine Forks in 321 BC, Rome abandoned the phalanx entirely and developed the manipular system. Each maniple could operate independently, advancing or retreating as needed, probing for weaknesses. This gave the legion tactical flexibility that the phalanx simply did not possess. So in a tactical matchup on ideal terrain, open and flat, the phalanx wins. On broken terrain, the legion wins. And in Italy, broken terrain is the norm, not the exception. But Alexander's army was not just a phalanx. It was a combined arms force, where cavalry played the decisive role. The Companion Cavalry, 1,800 elite horsemen led by Alexander himself, was the weapon that won his battles. At Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, the pattern was the same. The phalanx fixed the enemy infantry in place. The companions smashed through the enemy cavalry, then wheeled and struck the enemy infantry from behind. This was the hammer and anvil tactic, and it worked every time. Rome in 323 BC had weak cavalry. Roman citizens fought as infantry, not cavalry. The Roman cavalry was composed of the wealthiest citizens, but they were not professional horsemen. They served for a few months, then returned to their estates. Roman tactics relied almost entirely on infantry. The cavalry's job was to screen the flanks and pursue broken enemies, not to win battles. This is a massive advantage for Alexander. Even on broken terrain where the phalanx struggles, the companions can exploit gaps, strike supply lines, and hunt down Roman commanders. Roman consuls fought with their men personally leading charges, making themselves targets. Alexander excelled at decapitation strikes, killing or routing enemy commanders to collapse enemy morale. At Issus, when Darius fled, the entire Persian army disintegrated. Would Roman legions hold if their consul fell in battle? The historical record says yes. Romans did not have the same command structure as the Persians. A Persian army was built around the king. If the king fell or fled, the army had no reason to keep fighting. Roman legions were built around the centurions, junior officers who led from the front and commanded absolute loyalty from their men. A Roman legion could lose its consul and keep fighting because each maniple had its centurion, and each centurion knew what to do. But there is a limit to how much damage a legion can sustain before it breaks. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, nearly a century after our scenario, A Roman army of 80,000 men faced Hannibal's army of 50,000. Hannibal's cavalry destroyed the Roman cavalry, then attacked the Roman infantry from behind. Trapped in a double envelopment with cavalry attacking from all sides, 50,000 Romans were killed in a single day. The legions broke and were slaughtered. Cannae proved that Roman infantry, no matter how disciplined, could be destroyed if the cavalry battle was lost decisively enough. Alexander had the cavalry to replicate Cannae. His companions, supported by Thessalian cavalry and allied horse, numbered over 4,000, twice the size of typical Roman cavalry contingents. If Alexander could win the cavalry battle, he could roll up the Roman flanks and destroy legions piecemeal. But there is a problem. Cavalry, even elite cavalry, suffers casualties. At the Battle of the Volturnus in our scenario, Alexander lost 500 companions pursuing fleeing Romans into ambushes. At Beneventum, the companions charged the Triarii and were forced to withdraw. Every battle erodes cavalry strength, and unlike infantry, cavalry cannot be easily replaced. Horses must be bred, trained, and transported. Cavalrymen must be trained from childhood. Alexander's companions were irreplaceable. By the time he reached Rome in our scenario, he had fewer than 1,500 left, and Rome could field 10 legions, 50,000 men. Even the best cavalry cannot overcome those odds indefinitely. Let us examine the infantry more closely. The Macedonian Phalangite was a professional soldier. He trained year-round. He served for years, sometimes decades. He was paid from the royal treasury. He was equipped with standardized weapons and armor. He drilled constantly to maintain the cohesion that made the phalanx work. A Phalangite knew that his survival depended on the man next to him, and that man depended on him. This created an esprit de corps, a unit cohesion that was unmatched in the ancient world. The Roman legionary in 323 BC was not a professional. He was a citizen soldier who provided his own equipment, served for the duration of a campaign, then went home. His equipment varied depending on his wealth. Rich citizens wore bronze breastplates and carried good shields. Poor citizens wore linen corselets and carried cheaper gear. Training was inconsistent. Some legionaries had fought in multiple campaigns and were veterans. Others were raw recruits who had never seen battle. On paper, the Macedonian infantry should be superior in every measurable way. But wars are not fought on paper. The Roman legionary had something the Macedonian Phalangite did not: skin in the game. The Phalangite was fighting for Alexander's glory, for pay, for loot. The Roman was fighting for his city, his family, his land. When a Roman legion broke and ran, it meant Rome might fall, might be enslaved, might be erased from history. That knowledge made Roman soldiers fight with a desperation that mercenaries and professionals could not match. History shows us that desperate men are dangerous. At the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC, 300 Spartans held a mountain pass against hundreds of thousands of Persians for 3 days. They did not hold because they were better fighters, though they were excellent. They held because they knew that if they broke, Persia would conquer Greece. At the Battle of Alesia in 52 BC, Julius Caesar's legions held off a Gallic relief army of 250,000 men while simultaneously besieging 80,000 Gauls inside the fortress. They held because they knew that if they broke, they would all die. Desperation is a force multiplier. Rome in 323 BC was desperate. Alexander was the greatest conqueror in history, and he was marching on Rome. Every Roman knew what had happened to the cities that resisted Alexander. Tyre was besieged, stormed, and its population enslaved. Thebes, in Greece, rebelled against Alexander in 335 BC and was razed to the ground, its 6,000 survivors sold into slavery. Rome knew it was fighting for survival, that knowledge would make even raw recruits fight like veterans. But desperation is not enough if the tactical matchup is too lopsided. At Gaugamela, the Persian infantry fought desperately to protect Darius, and they were slaughtered by the Phalanx. Desperation cannot overcome a 6-meter reach advantage, except, as we discussed, the Phalanx only has that reach advantage on flat ground. In the hills and valleys of Italy, where maniples can swarm around the flanks and strike from multiple directions, desperation combined with tactical flexibility becomes decisive. Much of the Italian campaign would not be fought in open battles, it would be fought in sieges. Italy in the 4th century BC was dotted with fortified cities. Rome itself was surrounded by the Servian wall, 6 meters high and 4 meters thick. Capua, Nola, Beneventum, and dozens of smaller towns had walls. The Samnite hill forts were built on nearly inaccessible heights. To conquer Italy, Alexander would have to take these cities one by one. Alexander was the greatest besieger in ancient history. At Tyre, he built a causeway half a kilometre long across open water to reach an island fortress, then stormed the walls with siege towers and catapults. The siege lasted 7 months, but Alexander never wavered. When the city fell, he crucified 2,000 defenders and enslaved 30,000 civilians as an example to other cities. At Gaza, he besieged a fortress built on a high mound in the desert. His engineers built siege mounds even higher than the city walls, then brought up catapults and battered the defences into rubble. The city fell after 2 months. At the Sogdian Rock in Bactria, he faced a fortress built on a sheer cliff that the defenders claimed was impregnable. Alexander sent climbers up the cliff face at night using iron pegs and ropes. At dawn, the defenders woke to find Macedonian soldiers above them, and they surrendered. Rome could not match this expertise. Roman siege warfare in 323 BC was primitive. The Romans besieged cities by surrounding them and starving them out, a process that could take months or years. They did not have sophisticated siege engines. They did not have professional engineers. Their standard tactic was to build a rampart around the city, cut off supplies, and wait. This worked against the Samnites, who could not afford long sieges and eventually negotiated. But it would not work against Alexander. However, there is a critical difference between besieging cities in Asia and besieging cities in Italy. In Asia, Alexander besieged cities that were isolated, cut off from relief. Tyre could not be reinforced because Alexander controlled the sea. Gaza could not be reinforced because it was in the middle of a desert. The Sogdian Rock could not be reinforced because it was in the mountains of Afghanistan, thousands of kilometres from anywhere. But the cities of Italy were not isolated. Rome could send armies to relieve besieged cities, and as our scenario showed when Alexander besieged Rome, the Roman army attacked his siege lines and drove him off. This creates a strategic problem for Alexander. He cannot ignore fortified cities because they threaten his supply lines, but he cannot besiege them without tying down his army and exposing himself to Roman relief forces. At Tyre, Alexander besieged the city with his entire army, and no enemy could interfere. In Italy, if he besieges Capua with his entire army, Rome can gather forces elsewhere and strike at his supply base in Tarentum. If he divides his forces, besieging multiple cities simultaneously, he risks defeat in detail. The Romans conversely benefit from the fact that every city in Italy is a potential fortress. Even if Alexander wins battles in the open field, he must still reduce each city individually. This turns the campaign into a grinding war of attrition, exactly the kind of war that favours Rome. Logistics is the unglamorous but decisive factor in pre-modern warfare. Armies march on their stomachs. A Macedonian Phalangite needed approximately 1 kilogram of grain per day, plus meat, oil, and wine. A soldier also needed fodder for his pack animals. An army of 40,000 men required at least 40 tons of grain per day, plus fodder for thousands of horses and mules. That is 14,600 tons of grain per year. Where does it come from? In Alexander's Persian campaign, this was not a problem. Persia was the richest empire in the world. When Alexander captured Persian supply depots, he found vast stores of grain, gold, and equipment. He could feed his army off the spoils of conquest. When he marched through fertile regions like Mesopotamia, he requisitioned grain from local populations. When supplies ran low, he had a fleet that could ship grain from Egypt or Phoenicia. Italy was poor. It did not have vast supply depots. Campania was fertile, but its grain production was already stretched, feeding the local population. Latium and Samnium were less fertile, producing barely enough grain to feed their own people. Alexander could requisition grain from the areas he controlled, but this made him unpopular with the locals and risked rebellion. He could import grain from Sicily or North Africa, but this required controlling the sea, and Rome had allies in Sicily who could interdict his supply ships. Moreover, Alexander's supply line stretched from Macedonia through Greece, across the Adriatic, to Tarentum, then overland to wherever his army was campaigning. This supply line was over 1,500 kilometers long and vulnerable at every point. Roman raiders could attack supply convoys on the Via Appia. Roman allies could blockade Tarentum. Pirates could intercept grain ships crossing the Adriatic. Every kilometre Alexander advanced into Italy, his supply line grew longer and more vulnerable. Rome's supply situation was better. Rome controlled central Italy, including Latium, which was close to the city. Rome had allies in Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa who could ship grain. Rome had a port at Ostia where supplies could be unloaded and transported upriver to the city. Most importantly, Rome's supply lines were short. Even if Alexander captured Campania, Rome could still feed itself. History shows us that long supply lines destroy armies. Hannibal invaded Italy in 218 BC and won every major battle for 15 years, but he could never take Rome because he could not sustain a siege. His army shrank through attrition, his allies deserted him, and eventually Rome wore him down. Alexander might face the same fate. He could win battles, but if he could not feed his army, he would have to withdraw. Let us examine the manpower equation. Alexander's army in 323 BC numbered approximately 40,000 men. These were drawn from Macedonia, which had a population of perhaps 500,000, and from Greek allies. Macedonia could provide perhaps 10,000 reinforcements per year without crippling its economy. Greek allies could provide another 5,000, so Alexander could replace at most 15,000 casualties per year. Rome in 323 BC had a population of perhaps 200,000 citizens. The Latin allies added another 500,000. Campania, if loyal, added another 300,000. Rome could field approximately 60,000 soldiers per year without destroying its economy. In extremis, Rome could mobilize every able-bodied man and field 100,000 soldiers, though this would collapse the economy. The mathematics are stark. Alexander can replace 15,000 men per year. Rome can replace 60,000. In a war of attrition, Rome has a 4-to-1 advantage. Every battle, even if Alexander wins, erodes his strength more than Rome's. At the Battle of Beneventum in our scenario, Alexander lost 1,500 dead. At the Volturnus, he lost 500. At the Servian Wall, he lost 500. In 3 battles. Alexander lost 2,500 men, 15% of his cavalry and infantry. He won 1 battle, drew 1, and lost 1. Rome lost more men in absolute numbers, but Rome had more men to lose. By the end of the first campaign season in our scenario, Alexander's army had shrunk from 40,000 to 35,000. If the war continued for a second year, he would lose another 5,000. By the third year, his army would be too small to campaign effectively, and even if reinforcements arrived from Macedonia, they would be raw recruits, not the veterans who had marched from India. Rome, meanwhile, could replace its losses and raise new legions. Roman soldiers were not as skilled as Macedonian professionals, but they learned on the job. A legion that survived one campaign was a veteran legion. Rome had the manpower to lose battles and keep fighting. Alexander did not. This is the fundamental strategic problem Alexander faces. He cannot win a war of attrition. In Italy, he needs to win quickly, decisively, before his army is bled white. But Rome's strategy is designed to prevent quick, decisive victories. Rome refuses battle unless conditions are favourable. Rome uses fortified cities to slow Alexander's advance. Rome raids his supply lines, Rome waits. Alexander was a military genius. At 20 he conquered Greece. At 25 he defeated Persia. At 30 he reached India. He never lost a battle. He personally led charges, risking his life to inspire his men. He was wounded 9 times. He planned campaigns with meticulous detail and improvised brilliantly when plans fell apart. He understood logistics, tactics, strategy, and psychology. He was, quite simply, one of the greatest commanders who ever lived. Rome in 323 BC did not have a military genius. Roman consuls were elected annually and commanded for a single year. Some were competent, some were mediocre, few were brilliant. But Rome did not need brilliant commanders. Rome had a system. The manipular legion was designed to win even when commanded by average generals. The maniple structure gave junior officers, the centurions, the flexibility to make tactical decisions without waiting for orders from above. A Roman legion could function even if its consul was killed. This is a profound difference. Alexander's army was built around his genius. If Alexander died, the army would fracture. We know this because it happened. When Alexander died in 323 BC in actual history, his generals fought each other for 40 years, carving up the empire into pieces. None of them could replicate Alexander's success. The Macedonian army remained excellent, but it was no longer invincible. Rome's system was resilient. At Cannae in 216 BC, Rome lost 50,000 men, the worst defeat in Roman history. The Senate could have sued for peace. Instead, it raised new legions and kept fighting. When Hannibal killed Roman consuls, Rome elected new ones. When Hannibal destroyed armies, Rome raised new armies. Rome lost battles but never lost the will to fight. This resilience was Rome's greatest weapon. In our scenario, if Alexander had been killed at Beneventum or the Servian Wall, the Macedonian army would have collapsed. Parmenion, Craterus, Perdiccas, all excellent generals, but none of them were Alexander. The companions would have quarrelled over who should lead. The Samnites would have abandoned the alliance. The campaign would have ended. If a Roman consul had been killed, which happened at the Volturnus in our scenario, Rome simply elected a new one. The legions kept fighting. This asymmetry means that Alexander is a single point of failure. Rome is not. Alexander must avoid death or capture at all costs. Rome can afford to lose commanders. In our scenario, Alexander allied with the Samnites, Rome's enemies. This makes strategic sense. The Samnites were fierce warriors who knew the terrain and hated Rome. But alliances in ancient warfare were fragile. Allies fought for plunder, for revenge, for promises of independence. If the war turned against Alexander, the Samnites would desert him. History provides a template. In 280 BC, 50 years after our scenario, Pyrrhus of Epirus invaded Italy. Pyrrhus was a brilliant general, a student of Alexander's tactics, and he brought an army equipped and trained in the Macedonian style. He also allied with the Samnites and the Greek cities of southern Italy. At the Battle of Heraclea in 280 BC, Pyrrhus defeated a Roman army using the phalanx and elephants. At the Battle of Asculum in 279 BC, he defeated another Roman army, though at such heavy cost that he gave rise to the term Pyrrhic victory. But Pyrrhus could not break Rome. The Romans kept raising new legions. Pyrrhus's allies, seeing that the war was unwinnable, began to desert. The Samnites made peace with Rome. The Greek cities closed their gates to Pyrrhus. By 275 BC, Pyrrhus withdrew from Italy, having won every battle but lost the war. Alexander was a better general than Pyrrhus, but the strategic situation was similar. The Samnites would fight alongside Alexander only as long as victory seemed likely. After Beneventum, when Alexander failed to crush the Romans, Samnite enthusiasm would wane. After the failed siege of Rome, many Samnites would drift home. By the second year of the campaign, Alexander could not count on Samnite support. Moreover, the Samnites had their own agenda. They wanted independence, not to replace Roman domination with Macedonian domination. If Alexander won, he would not grant the Samnites independence. He would incorporate Samnium into his empire as a subject territory. The Samnites would realize this eventually and might turn on Alexander if given the opportunity. Rome, conversely, could exploit this. Rome could offer the Samnites better terms than Alexander. End the rebellion, accept a negotiated peace, and retain your autonomy under Roman protection. Some Samnite leaders, tired of war, might accept. This would leave Alexander isolated in Italy with a dwindling army and no allies. Let us suppose that after the failed siege of Rome, Alexander realized he could not win through conventional means. What options would he have had? Option 1. Diplomatic victory. Alexander could have offered Rome terms that preserved Roman independence in exchange for recognition of Macedonian supremacy. Rome would remain a free city, but it would send tribute, provide troops for Alexander's future campaigns, and acknowledge Alexander as overlord. This is how Alexander treated many Greek cities. It preserved their dignity while binding them to his empire. Would Rome have accepted? Possibly, if the alternative was total destruction. But Roman pride was legendary. Rome had never bent the knee to any foreign power, and the Senate might refuse terms even if it meant prolonging the war. The historical Rome rejected peace offers from Pyrrhus and Hannibal even after devastating defeats. Pride mattered more than survival. Option 2. Scorched earth. Alexander could have systematically destroyed every farm, every town, every resource in Latium and Campania, turning central Italy into a wasteland. This would force Rome to sue for peace or starve. But this strategy had drawbacks. It would make Alexander hated throughout Italy, guaranteeing future rebellions. It would destroy the very wealth he was trying to conquer, and it would take years, time that Alexander did not have. Option 3. Decapitation strike. Alexander could have attempted to assassinate the Roman Senate, send infiltrators into Rome, bribe disloyal citizens and eliminate the leadership in a single night. Without the Senate, Rome might collapse into chaos. But this was risky. Roman security was good, and discovery would turn the entire population against him. Moreover, Rome had a tradition of replacing fallen leaders. Kill one senator, and another would take his place. Option 4. Withdrawal and return. Alexander could have withdrawn from Italy, returned to Macedonia, consolidated his empire, and returned with a larger army in a few years. This would give him time to build up strength and prepare for a longer campaign. But withdrawal would be seen as defeat. Alexander's prestige depended on never losing. If he withdrew from Italy, his empire might fracture. Subject peoples might rebel if they saw that Alexander was not invincible. None of these options guaranteed victory. Each had serious drawbacks. This is the core problem. Italy was not Persia. It could not be conquered quickly, and Alexander did not have the resources for a long war. Let us briefly consider the opposite scenario. What if Alexander had won? What if, at the Battle of Beneventum, the companions had broken through and killed both consuls? What if the Roman army had routed and Alexander had pursued, slaughtering 50,000 Romans in a single day? What if he had then marched on Rome, breached the walls, and sacked the city? Would that have ended the war? History says probably not. When the Gauls sacked Rome in 390 BC, 70 years before our scenario, the Romans retreated to the capital in Hill, paid the Gauls to leave, then rebuilt and continued fighting. Rome had a culture that did not accept defeat. Even if the city fell, the Senate could retreat to allied cities, raise new legions, and continue the war. But if Alexander had killed or captured the entire Senate, if he had enslaved the Roman population, if he had razed the city to the ground as he did to Thebes, then yes, Rome would have ended. But this would require a level of ruthlessness that even Alexander might have hesitated to employ. Destroying Rome would send a message to every other city in Italy: resist and die. This might cow some cities into submission, but it would also inspire others to fight to the death, knowing that surrender meant annihilation. Moreover, destroying Rome would not end Italian resistance. The Samnites, the Latins, the Etruscans, all had their own cities and their own armies. Alexander would have to conquer the entire peninsula, city by city, and garrison it to prevent rebellions. This would require 50,000 men minimum, and Alexander did not have 50,000 men to spare. His empire stretched from Greece to India, and every region needed garrisons. So even in the best-case scenario for Alexander, where he destroys Rome in a single campaign, he would face decades of guerrilla warfare and rebellion. Italy would become a running sore, draining resources and manpower from the rest of the empire. This is what happened to Rome itself when it conquered Spain. The conquest began in 218 BC and took 200 years to complete because Spanish tribes refused to accept Roman rule. Italy, with its mountains and fierce warrior cultures, could have been Spain on steroids. War is ultimately a test of will. The side that is willing to endure more pain, more loss, more suffering, usually wins. Alexander's army had high morale at the start of the campaign. They had conquered the Persian Empire. They believed they were invincible, but morale erodes with time and casualties. By the second year of the Italian campaign, Macedonian soldiers would be asking themselves why they were fighting. Italy was poor. There was little plunder. Every battle cost lives. Home was thousands of kilometers away. Alexander's officers, according to our scenario, began to murmur about withdrawal. If the war dragged into a third year, morale would collapse, and the army might refuse to fight. Rome's morale was different. Romans were fighting for survival. They were defending their homes, their families, their city. This is the most powerful motivation in warfare. Studies of soldier psychology show that men fight hardest when defending their homeland. They will endure casualties and hardships that would break mercenaries or conscripts. Moreover, Rome had a cultural tradition of never surrendering. Roman children were raised on stories of Horatius holding the bridge against the Etruscans, of Cincinnatus leaving his plough to save Rome, of the 300 Fabii dying to the last man rather than surrender. Surrender was shameful. Defeat was temporary. This cultural mindset made Rome incredibly difficult to defeat. Alexander understood psychology. He cultivated his image as invincible, as favoured by the gods, as destined to conquer the world. But in Italy, that image would tarnish. After Beneventum, after the failed siege of Rome, whispers would start. Maybe Alexander was not invincible. Maybe the gods had abandoned him. Once that seed of doubt took root, it would grow. And once Alexander's invincibility was questioned, the entire foundation of his empire would be at risk. One factor often overlooked in ancient warfare is the ability to innovate. Alexander's army used the best military technology of the era. The sarissa, the Ziston lance, the Macedonian armour, all were cutting edge. But technology evolves, especially during wartime. Would Rome have adapted and innovated to counter Alexander's advantages? History says yes. Rome was incredibly good at adopting enemy weapons and tactics. During the Samnite Wars, Rome adopted the manipular system from observing Samnite tactics. During the Punic Wars, Rome copied Carthaginian ship designs to build a navy. After fighting Gallic warriors, Rome adopted chain mail. Rome was pragmatic. If an enemy had a weapon or tactic that worked, Rome would copy it. If Alexander's phalanx proved superior in open battle, Rome would develop anti-phalanx tactics. We have already discussed some of these: refusing engagement on flat ground, attacking the flanks, using skirmishers to disrupt formation. But Rome might go further. Roman engineers could develop palisade barriers, sharpened stakes that could be planted in front of the legion to stop a phalanx charge. Roman blacksmiths could forge longer spears to match the sarissa's reach, though these would be unwieldy for the manipular system. Rome could develop caltrops and pit traps specifically designed to break up phalanx formations. Rome might also have adopted combined arms tactics. If the weakness of Roman infantry was cavalry, Rome could hire or train better cavalry. The Numidian cavalry from North Africa was excellent. Rome could have hired Numidian mercenaries to counter the Companions, or Rome could have trained its own heavy cavalry using Gallic horses and Greek tactics. This is speculative, but the pattern is clear. Rome adapted and innovated faster than most ancient states. If the war lasted multiple years, Rome would evolve its military to counter Alexander's advantages. Alexander, with a finite army far from home, could not evolve as quickly. We have examined tactics, logistics, manpower, morale, alliances, psychology, and technology. We have walked through a hypothetical campaign in detail. Now we must answer the question: who wins? The answer depends on the time frame. If Alexander has 1 year to conquer Rome, he has a chance. He is the better tactical commander. His army is superior unit for unit. If he can force Rome into a decisive battle on favourable terrain, he can win. The Battle of the Volturnus in our scenario showed that Alexander can destroy Roman legions in the open field. If he destroys enough legions quickly enough, Rome might sue for peace before its manpower advantage matters. But if the war lasts more than 1 year, Alexander's chances diminish rapidly. Every month, his army shrinks through casualties and disease. Every month his supply situation worsens. Every month Rome raises new legions and learns to fight the phalanx more effectively. By the second year, the manpower imbalance becomes decisive. By the third year, Alexander's army would be too small to campaign, and he would have to withdraw. The most likely outcome is what we saw in our scenario. Alexander wins, battles but cannot deliver a knockout blow. Rome avoids decisive engagements, bleeds Alexander through attrition, and outlasts him. After 2 to 3 years, Alexander withdraws, having failed to conquer Rome. This is not a satisfying answer for those who believe in the power of genius, but it is the answer supported by logic, history, and the realities of pre-modern warfare. However, there is one scenario where Alexander wins decisively. If, in the first few months of the campaign, Alexander manages to kill or capture the entire Roman Senate in a single engagement, Rome might collapse. The Senate was the heart of Roman governance. Without it, the Republic might fracture into warring factions, and Alexander could conquer the pieces individually. But this requires a level of luck and tactical perfection that even Alexander could not guarantee. And as we have discussed, Rome's resilience was such that even the destruction of the Senate might not end the war. So here is the brutal truth. Alexander the Great, the man who conquered the known world, would probably have failed to conquer Rome, not because he was a worse general, not because his army was inferior, but because the strategic and logistical realities of a campaign in Italy favoured Rome. Alexander was built for speed, for decisive battles, for campaigns that ended in months. Rome was built for endurance, for grinding wars, for conflicts that lasted decades. The Macedonian Phalanx was the best infantry formation of its era, but it was designed for the plains of Asia, not the mountains of Italy. The Companion Cavalry was the finest in the world, but 1,800 horsemen cannot conquer a peninsula. Alexander's genius could win battles, but it could not overcome geography, logistics, and the will of an entire people to resist. Rome would have lost battles, Rome would have lost legions, Rome would have lost cities, but Rome would not have lost the war. And in the end, that is all that matters. If Alexander had marched west instead of east, if he had landed at Tarentum in 323 BC and marched on Rome, the war would have dragged on for 2 to 3 years. Alexander would have won brilliant victories. He would have destroyed Roman armies at the Volturnus and elsewhere. But he would have failed to take Rome. His army would have shrunk to the point where further campaigning was impossible. His allies would have deserted him, and eventually he would have withdrawn, returning to Macedonia to consolidate his empire. Rome would have survived, bloodied but unbowed. This is not the answer that enthusiasts of Alexander want to hear, but it is the answer that the evidence supports. Genius matters in warfare, but logistics, manpower, geography, and cultural willpower matter more. And in all of those categories, Rome had the advantage. The one caveat: everything we have discussed assumes Alexander does not die in battle. If Alexander had been killed by a lucky javelin throw at Beneventum or a Roman gladius at the Servian wall, the Macedonian army would have collapsed immediately, and Rome would have won decisively. Alexander's genius was his greatest weapon, but it was also his greatest vulnerability. He was a single point of failure, and in a multi-year campaign in hostile territory, the odds of that single point failing were high. So the final verdict: Rome wins, 70% probability. Alexander wins, 20% probability. Stalemate leading to negotiated peace, 10% probability. Rome's advantages in manpower, logistics, strategic depth, and cultural resilience outweigh Alexander's advantages in tactical genius and battlefield superiority. This is the war for the world that never happened. And for Alexander, it is fortunate that it never did. We have spent 3 hours exploring a war that never happened. We have mapped out campaigns, fought battles, analysed tactics, and reached a verdict. But what is the point of alternate history? Is it just intellectual exercise, a game of what-ifs with no real-world relevance? The answer is no. Alternate history teaches us about the forces that shape real history. By asking what would have happened if Alexander had invaded Italy, we learn about why Alexander succeeded in Persia and what would have stopped him. We learn about the strengths and weaknesses of different military systems. We learn that genius can win battles, but systems win wars. We learn that logistics and geography matter more than tactics. We learn that the will to resist is the most powerful weapon in any conflict. These are not abstract lessons. They apply to every war in history. Napoleon was a military genius like Alexander, but he failed in Russia because he could not overcome logistics and the Russian winter. Hitler was not a genius, but his generals were excellent, and they conquered most of Europe. But they failed in the Soviet Union for the same reasons Alexander would have failed in Italy: overextended supply lines, underestimated enemy resilience, and the refusal of the defenders to quit. The United States won every major battle in Vietnam but lost the war because tactical superiority does not guarantee strategic victory. The war between Alexander and Rome teaches us that wars are not decided by single battles or individual heroes. They are decided by economics, by population, by logistics, by the determination of entire societies. Alexander was the greatest tactical general in history, but that was not enough to conquer a state that refused to be conquered. So what if Alexander had invaded Italy? We would remember him not as Alexander the Great, but as Alexander the Overreacher. We would remember him as a brilliant general who won too many battles and lost the war, and we would remember Rome not as the city that conquered the Mediterranean, but as the city that defeated the greatest conqueror in history. But history went another way. Alexander marched east, conquered Persia, and died in Babylon at age 32. Rome conquered Italy over the next 2 centuries, then expanded to dominate the entire Mediterranean, and 2,000 years later, we remember both as titans of the ancient world. Perhaps it is better that they never met on the battlefield. Some matchups are better left to the imagination. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the war that never was. This is Wars in History, where we explore the brutal truth of warfare, the strategies, the tactics, and the human cost of every battle. If you made it through all 3 hours, you are a true student of military history. And if you learned something, if you saw ancient warfare in a new light, then this was time well spent. If you want more deep dives like this, if you want to support the channel and get exclusive content, head over to our Patreon. Patreon supporters get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and input on future topics. You can find the link in the description, and if Patreon is not your thing, just liking, subscribing, and sharing this video helps immensely. This is Wars in History. Until next time, remember, history is written by the victors, but we tell the stories of everyone who fought. Stay brutal, stay curious, and never stop learning.